Tatiana has been ranked as the best restaurant in New York City for 2 years in a row by the former food critic Pete Wells of the New York Times. It has received stellar reviews, and subsequently, it's one of the hardest reservations to snag in the city. The food is unique and it looks utterly delicious, so I had to do whatever it took to dine at Tatiana. Today it is gray, rainy, cold, and miserable out. That is why I'm here inside my apartment, but I got to do something very special today. I went to one of the most hyped restaurants in all of New York City and one of the most hyped restaurants in the entire country. I went to Tatiana. From the moment Tatiana opened their doors, the restaurant has gotten so many positive reviews and accolades from critics and diners alike. In fact, Pete Wells, the now former New York Times restaurant critic, listed Tatiana as the best restaurant in New York City 2 years in a row. As a result, the restaurant has literally become the most sought after place to dine at in New York City. It is the hardest reservation to get. Now, I've been meaning to go to Tatiana for a while now, but I thought, like a lot of other people, that the restaurant had a good shot of gaining a Michelin star, and the Michelin guide came out yesterday, and unfortunately, Tatiana was once again left starless. That doesn't mean the restaurant won't get one in the future, and I think it still has a great shot of eventually gaining a Michelin star, and I'm definitely rooting for the restaurant because they are doing something very different and very special. It's sort of difficult to label what kind of restaurant Tatiana is. They serve Afro Caribbean cuisine, but there's a notable New York City influence in it, in that there's a lot of different cultures represented in that cuisine. Just like how there are a lot of different cultures represented here in New York City. In fact, Kwame Onwuachi, the chef of Tatiana, called the restaurant his love letter to New York. That's part of the reason why I've been so excited to go to Tatiana, because it seems like such an ideal representation of New York City, which is in my opinion the best city on earth. But like I said, it's pretty much the hardest reservation to get in New York City, and I didn't even have a reservation. However, Tatiana has a bar with 6 seats, and they reserve those 6 seats solely for walk-ins. So that's how I was able to dine at Tatiana today. I showed up early, I waited a bit, and I got one of those coveted bar seats and had a really special meal. This was my dinner at Tatiana. Tatiana is located on the Upper West Side within Lincoln Center, the home to such New York City cultural touchstones as the Metropolitan Opera and the New York City Ballet. The restaurant is the product of Chef Kwame Onwuachi, a New York native that spent time in Nigeria where he developed a love for African cuisine. He worked at some very notable restaurants like the 3 Michelin-starred Per Se and the 3 Michelin-starred 11 Madison Park. Kwame was even a contestant on season 13 of Top Chef. Eventually, he opened his own establishment called Shaw Bijou in Washington, D.C. The restaurant had a lot of promise, but unfortunately it closed in less than 3 months. It was certainly a learning experience, but Kwame persevered and eventually opened Tatiana. I knew that I would have to get to the restaurant early if I wanted to dine there. I arrived at 4 and there was already a person ahead of me in line. Tatiana opens at 5, so I had an hour wait, but I was prepared for it. For my afternoon caffeine hit, I was strategic about my beverage decision as I ordered a double espresso from Zebetto Espresso Bar as opposed to a heavier 12-ounce drip coffee. Once in line, I knew there wouldn't be any bathroom breaks. I also had a good book to read, which kept me entertained. It was certainly cold, but not as bad as it could have been. Plus, I didn't have to worry about the rain since the area where Tatiana was covered. At about 4:35, an employee from the restaurant distributed tea to those in line, which was a nice gesture of hospitality. I believe that it was a hibiscus tea, and I liked it. At 5 o'clock, the restaurant opened their doors. Those with reservations were seen to first, and then the walk-ins like me were accommodated. I was seated at one of the coveted 6 bar seats. The restaurant isn't the largest, and some of the tables I thought were a bit close together, but it was overall nice. Tatiana was dimly lit and the music was loud. Although I knew about that aspect beforehand, as it's made quite clear on Tatiana's Resi page about the noise level. However, it didn't bother me that much, probably because I was so enamored with the food that I tuned everything else out. What did annoy me though were the bathrooms. I believe there were only 2 individual toilets and there always seemed to be a line for them. Once again, getting that espresso during the afternoon was a wise choice. After getting comfortable, I began to look over the menu. Before going to any restaurant, I love checking out their offerings online. However, Tatiana committed one of my ultimate restaurant pet peeves of not including prices on their website. Knowing the prices helps me to make my decision when it comes to ordering. Unfortunately, Tatiana is pretty expensive, especially regarding the dishes that I wanted to try. At the same time though, their menu is incredibly intriguing as the courses are imbued with not only an Afro Caribbean influence, but a wide-ranging encapsulation of the numerous cuisines that can be found throughout New York City. Frankly, every dish sounded fantastic. Next, I looked over the beverage options. There was a selection of wines by the glass, but I felt like a cocktail. I went with the core values. The drink contained Rye & Sons Rye, Rum JM Terroir Volcanique, Brucato Amaro Woodlands, and Never Sink Apple Aperitif. It was a good cocktail, although it wasn't exactly what I was expecting considering the components that went into it. Nevertheless, it was still a good drink, but because I was seated at the bar, I got to view all the other cocktails that were sent out to diners, and frankly, they looked a little more interesting compared to what I had. If I had to redo my order, I probably would have went with another beverage, but like I said, it was still pretty good. It wasn't long until I was presented with my first course of the night, the curried goat patties. The appetizer is pretty much one of Tatiana's signature dishes, and I had to order it. Besides the 3 patties, there were small cups of a green seasoning aioli and a mango chutney. First, I wanted to try the patty just as it was without any of the condiments. It was absolutely incredible. The goat was perfectly cooked, it was nice and moist, and the flavors were spot on. The half-moon shaped patties were executed to perfection as well. They were flaky and delicate, but robust enough to maintain the goat curry filling. Simply put, the goat patties were flawless. They were incredible just on their own, but both of the condiments complemented the dish well. The green seasoning aioli added a nice creaminess and savoriness to the patties. The mango chutney, on the other hand, lent a pleasant sweetness, which equated to a nice contrast of savory and sweet. One negative about the course was its price tag. It was $26, which I thought was a little high. Nevertheless, I loved that dish, and even though it looked quite simple, it was crafted to perfection. Next up was my main course, and it was quite special. I got another of Tatiana's signature dishes, the short rib pastrami suya. The course contained boneless Wagyu short rib, caraway cocoa bread, melted red cabbage, and a mustard jus. Appearance-wise, the plate was mouth-watering, and I couldn't wait to dig in. First, I wanted to try the pastrami just as it was without adding anything to it. The meat was delicious. It was perfectly cooked and filled with flavor. It was also juicy and texturally on point. The meat had some nice fat and bark on it as well. For being served in New York City, probably the greatest place for pastrami, that meat could stand with the best of them. However, I don't think there's any other spot in NYC serving pastrami topped with a suya spice rub. That seasoning had so much flavor and was an excellent addition to the pastrami. It had a smoky, nutty, and savory taste, which I loved. While the pastrami on its own may be great, the magic of that dish comes from the combination of all the elements on that plate. So I fashioned together a mini sort of slider. I split a section of the bread in half and stuffed it with pastrami, red cabbage, and drizzled a bit of the mustard jus on the concoction. Together, that made for a spectacular creation. All of the components complemented each other perfectly. The cabbage added a pleasant but slight sourness and crispness, while the mustard contributed a good sweetness. I really liked the bread as well. Typically, the bread served with a pastrami sandwich from a New York City deli is such an afterthought compared to the meat. At Tatiana, that isn't the case, as the caraway cocoa bread was fresh, fluffy, and had spot-on flavor. Although, I wish there was a bit more bread compared to the amount of meat on the plate, but in a certain sense, this does ring true to the typical New York City pastrami sandwich, as there's seemingly never enough bread to hold together all the meat. As I was enjoying my food, it became pretty clear to me why the pastrami is a signature dish of Tatiana. It's a beautiful course, it's utterly delicious and comes with a unique twist with the suya seasoning. It's also a dish that has evolved a bit, as old posts on Tatiana's Instagram show that the pastrami was once served on the bone. To sum it up, I loved the course, although I wasn't a fan of its price. Costing $86, I'm left scratching my head as to why the course bared such a high price tag. It may be Wagyu beef, but the reality is the pastrami isn't quite on the same level as Katz's or my personal favorite, hometown barbecue. Although the additional components of the suya spice and the cocoa bread give the dish a sense of uniqueness, but those elements don't necessarily cost that much. One of the criticisms of Chef Kwame's first restaurant, Shaw Biju, were the high prices, and I feel like the pastrami was priced a bit too high. Still, that dish was amazing, and I'm glad that I ordered it, but the reality is Tatiana's menu bears a number of amazing sounding courses for much less. After finishing, it was time for dessert. I felt that the dessert menu wasn't as exciting as the restaurant's main menu, but the courses nevertheless sounded pretty good, although I knew what dish I was going to order before I even came to the restaurant. Once again, I chose one of Tatiana's signature dishes, the Bodega Special. The plate consisted of a cosmic brownie, powdered donut ice cream, and sorrel. It's a dessert that calls to mind the mass-produced packaged snacks, the ones that you would have as a kid from the likes of Hostess and Little Debbie. Visually, Tatiana's dessert looks just like those packaged treats, but with a slight touch of elegance. Flavor-wise, however, the Bodega Special is in another league. I tried the brownie first, and I was blown away. In my mind, I was expecting the dish to taste just like its packaged inspiration, but what I got was a perfectly executed, warm, chocolatey, and rich brownie. It was excellent. Next, I tried the little powdered donuts, but they weren't donuts. It was actually ice cream, meant to look like the donuts that they were imitating. It was shocking just how much they tasted like the classic packaged powdered donuts. The flavor was spot on, and as an ice cream, it completely worked. Combined with the brownie, it was a massively satisfying treat. Overall, the Bodega Special is a good dessert, but the elements of surprise, fun, and nostalgia make it a great dessert and an iconic dish. To sum it up, I loved my dinner at Tatiana. The food I had was excellent, and the menu was so original and unique, although I wish that I could have tried more, but it was costly to the point where I thought that certain dishes were a bit higher priced than they should have been. Nevertheless, I was so happy with the overall experience that the cost didn't bother me as much as it could have. And speaking of the price, after finishing my dessert, I was presented with the bill, which totaled to $163.32, but with my tip, I spent about $196. I just finished with Tatiana. That was so good. That place lives up to the hype. I loved everything I had. It was pretty damn expensive though, but it was worth it. It's still unfortunately raining, so I'm gonna head back home and share my final thoughts there. So I'm back here at my apartment. Yeah, like I said, that was a very special meal. Tatiana certainly lived up to the hype. It is worth jumping through all those hoops to get a reservation or waiting a long time in line. It is worth it. You know, there are so many amazing restaurants in New York City, but because of that, it is difficult to stand out. Tatiana stands out in all the best possible ways. Tatiana's menu was just awesome. There were so many intriguing and amazing sounding dishes on there. I would have loved to have tried every single one of them. However, Tatiana is unfortunately a costly restaurant, and I also think that some of the dishes are a little overpriced. The pastrami was awesome. I loved it. However, $86, yeah, I don't think it's worth $86. The curried goat patties were great, but $26? That's a bit high. Now, I would say for the most part, Tatiana's menu is sort of in line with the other fine dining restaurants in New York City in terms of price, which is to say it's expensive, but like I said, there are a few things on there that I do think are just overpriced. However, Tatiana's like no other restaurant, so you'll go there, you'll pay those high prices, and you'll still leave with a smile on your face like I did, even though it may be a little overpriced. So coming back to Pete Wells, how he named Tatiana the best restaurant in New York City for 2 years in a row. So it begs the question, is it the best restaurant in New York City? Now let's be clear, there's no one right answer to this question. It is super subjective of what one is actually looking for in a restaurant. However, I think you can kind of make the argument that Tatiana is the #1 restaurant in New York City of the moment. Although you could easily make that argument about other restaurants in New York City like Zhongxi, which just got 3 Michelin stars yesterday. Nevertheless, Tatiana is truly a special restaurant that is capturing the moment right now. It really ticks all the boxes. It has excellent food that is very unique, food that can't be found quite anywhere else. So I wouldn't necessarily go to Tatiana thinking that it is the best restaurant in New York City because everyone has different expectations of what they want in a restaurant. But it is a fantastic place, and I'm so happy that Tatiana reserves space for walk-ins. Now, I would like to give a shout out not only to Tatiana, but all the restaurants out there that reserve space for walk-ins. Now, I know it's not always feasible with every type of restaurant, particularly the super high-end, fancy, elaborate tasting menu places, but it is truly appreciated when the reservation game out there is pretty insane right now. To sum it up, as if it wasn't obvious, I really loved Tatiana. That food was absolutely amazing. It was original, it was delicious. Now, it wasn't a perfect restaurant, it was very expensive. My wallet did not like the restaurant, but at the end of the day, it was truly a special experience. Tatiana lived up to the hype, and I will certainly be back.